The sand of the desert is sodden red, red with the wreck of a square that broke. The Gatling's jammed and the colonel dead, and the regiment blind with dust and smoke. The river of death has brimmed his banks, and England's power and honour a name. The voice of a schoolboy rallies the ranks. Play up, and play the game.
Whew, they don't write them like that anymore, do they? It's a fantastic poem, stirring, patriotic stuff. Well, today we're discussing the man who inspired it. The man they called the bravest in England.
You know any prayers, my friend? I'll say one for you.
His life was straight from the pages of a swashbuckling novel. In fact, some people say he was the inspiration for Harry Flashman.
We are deeply indebted to Captain Flashman.
Do you know who it is? Well, it's this man, Colonel Frederick Gustavus Burnaby of the Royal Horse Guards. Fred, like me, was a Leicestershire lad. Unlike me, he was built like a brick outhouse, strong as an ox, brave as a lion. I think you get the point. He was pretty special. I could keep on going, but I think let's get stuck in to today's interview with John Hawkins, who's written 2 volumes on Fred's life. John started off by explaining Burnaby's early career as an officer in the Blues, a regiment he joined as a cornet in 1859.
There had been no previous family connection with the Royal Horse Guards as far as I've been able to turn out. But both Fred and his younger brother had been brought up in the countryside, spent a lot of their life in horseback. And it was natural that if he went into the army, he went into a cavalry regiment. The Blues were an elite regiment, and perhaps not quite of the stature of the 1st and 2nd Life Guards. But Fred was well connected, he had money, and he did well in his exams. So as a natural horseman, it's not at all surprising that the Blues took him on. It's also worth noting at that stage that 8 of his Burnaby relatives either had or had recently had commissions in the army at that point, and 2 of them were actually major generals. So again, the Burnaby name would have been, it wouldn't do any harm. So the Burnaby name would have been extremely well known. And in fact, it's worth also pointing out that the Burnabys weren't just famous in the army. They had been admirals in the navy, and they'd also been famous in literature and the law. So the family was a very highly regarded family.
Have you been able to get a sense in those early years of how he did in the military and how his sort of character developed in those early years?
Yes, I think I have, because in those days, there was a fundamental problem with heavy cavalry regiments, which is they were never called on for military action. I mean, the last time the heavy cavalry had been in action was at the Crimea, and not that successfully. So Fred's army career only really involved him in being in London with his regiment from sort of April through to September, October. The rest of the year, he was encouraged to go on leave. And that's many of his colleagues actually went on shooting expeditions. That's where the phrase shooting leave came about. Fred took the opportunity at that time to travel widely, not just in Europe, where he became very familiar with Spain and later Russia, but also South America and North America. So he was a very traveled man by that stage. Militarily, he became a lieutenant in 1861, and despite a well-publicized fracas, which got into the public newspapers, he achieved his captaincy in 1866. So he was making steady progress.
Okay, so he hasn't seen much action, but he is a bit of a traveller. I think in 1873, he went off to his beloved Spain and found himself caught up in the so-called Carlist Wars. Could you give us a very brief overview, firstly, of just what those wars were,
Yep,
and then what his role became?
Okay. He ended up in Spain in 1873 by accident. He'd always been fascinated by Khiva, which we'll come on to later, and he actually attempted a journey to Khiva early in 1873. He got as far as Naples, where he contracted typhoid, and spent months recovering, and decided to come back from Naples the long way via Spain, which he loved. And towards the end of that journey in Spain, he traveled through northwest Spain. Now, at this stage, there was significant activity in the War of the Spanish Succession. And the pretender to the Spanish throne, Don Carlos, had raised a military force with which he was harassing government troops in northwest Spain, which was his stronghold. And Fred traveled through Spain, came across Don Carlos, didn't stop immediately then, went on home, arranged with the army to continue his sick leave, and then traveled back to Spain with a commission from the editor of the Times to act as a war correspondent. And the war correspondency was actually gaining quite an important position in these states. So he was one of a number of journalists who were actually with the Carlist forces. So Fred at this stage, being an army officer, tied himself up with Don Carlos himself, and over the next 3 or 4 months, travelled nearly 1,000 miles on horseback through northwest Spain, engaging at numerous small but quite serious military actions. And although a non-combatant, he would be quite happy to stand in the front line with Don Carlos, dodging the bullets that were wrecking about. And among the other journalists, he developed a reputation of being absolutely fearless, not to mention foolhardy. And he wrote back some quite important letters to the Times describing what was going on. Now, Fred being Fred, was offering advice to Don Carlos from time to time, which came to the notice of the Spanish government, who said to the War Office in London that Fred was stretching the definition of a non-combatant, at which stage the War Office basically said to Fred, time to come home, which he did. But although he was not known for actually fighting many actions apart from El Teb and Abu Klea later, this was quite an important part in actually getting him used to the gunfire of military action.
And so you mentioned Khiva, that he tried to get there.
Yep.
Well, I think next he does actually manage, doesn't he? And Khiva, for those who don't know, is an incredibly remote spot right on the edge of the Russian Empire at this point, isn't it?
Well, it is. Okay, so Khiva is to the east of the Caspian Sea, in the middle of what are known as the Stans. In this period of time, Khiva was an ambition of the Russian Empire to extend south into the Khanates. And from time to time, they actually set off military expeditions which did this. By the time Fred had tried to go there for the first time in 1873, it was difficult to get there. By 1876, when he made his next effort, it was even more difficult. The Russians basically said, this is a place you cannot go anymore. And if he had said to the War Office he wanted to go, they would almost certainly put him off. So being Fred, he didn't. He just set out. But whereas the first time he tried to get to Khiva, he decided to cross the Mediterranean and then go east from Syria, this time he decided to go through Russia. So it's easy to get to Moscow in those days and not too difficult to get to South Russia. But the last 1,000 miles of the journey during the middle of a Russian winter were on a mixture of troika, pony, and camel. And he had no support. So this was, he obviously hired people along the way. So this was a very serious journey. And he eventually made it. He met the Khan of Khiva. By this stage, the Russian government had realized what he was up to and sent a troop of Cossacks to escort him home. And he went back to the War Office, where he got another dressing down for having done something which clearly wasn't really very acceptable to the British military authorities. But the upshot of this was, he, on his return, within a few weeks, wrote a book called A Ride to Khiva. And it was a rip-roaring tale of the journey. He's a very good writer, and it was a very good early example of adventure travel. And within 12 months, he'd sold 10 editions. Now, up to this point, Fred had been well known in the army, in high society, but he was, and to those people who read the Times, who knew of his letters, but he was now a public figure. And you couldn't walk down the street without him being recognized. So the world had changed for Fred at this point. If I can just go back to one thing, Fred did have a trip the previous year. Fred had had another shooting leave, and a lot of his friends were going down to Ethiopia to shoot tigers, like various creatures. And Fred went down with them as far as the southern end of the Red Sea. And he'd got a commission, this from the Times, but he'd been commissioned by the Times to go and interview General Gordon. So Gordon had been installed in Khartoum the year before with a mandate to try and eradicate the Nilotic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade, of course, had been stopped some years before, but there was still a vast flow of slaves up the Nile in slavery in the Middle East. And Gordon's job was to stop that. Fred arrived at the Red Sea, travelled eastwards across the desert by camel to Khartoum, met Gordon, who completely refused to be interviewed. But Fred then went back a different route. He went along up the Nile to Alexandria by boat, stopping off at various places en route. So by the end of that journey, Fred had a very sound knowledge of Sudan and Egypt, including the Nile and its cataracts. And this would be very valuable information for Fred some years later.
Fantastic. I mean, I think it's worth just pointing out, and I'm sure most people will realize this, a lot of these places he went are difficult and dangerous to go to now, yet alone when he did it. I mean, it's almost incomprehensible that he would do such journeys on his own.
Yeah, indeed. And I mean, occasionally he'd take a manservant with him, who I'm sure didn't necessarily volunteer for the job. But this one, for example, I mean, he went out, he picked up a traveling companion eventually, but he was meticulous in his travel plans. And he just had great confidence in his ability. The sad thing was that the last journey he intended to make, but he was thwarted by his death at Abu Klea, he had intended to travel to Timbuktu the year before. And even today, as you quite rightly say, Timbuktu is not the easiest place to get to. Okay.
So, well, let's move on then. So I think in 1877, he went and saw the Russo-Turkish War. How did he end up there, and what key military engagements did he witness?
Okay, so this is an interesting one. Fred's closest military friend was a man called Colonel Valentine Baker. Baker had commanded the very smart and fashionable 10th Hussars and was destined for high military office. Unfortunately, a few years before, he had been arrested and subsequently imprisoned for molesting a woman in a railway carriage between Surbiton and Woking. When he was brought to trial in Croydon, vast crowds turned up. He offered no defence, and so he was put in prison for a year, and on his release was cashiered. He is generally regarded to have been a superb officer. He was taken on shortly thereafter by the armies of the Ottoman Empire, who had a tradition of employing officers from overseas armies. Having got that appointment, the Russo-Turkish War broke out, and he was given a command in the western part of the empire, opposing the Russian forces. Fred managed to get out to Turkey on a bit of an excuse. At this stage, there was a committee which was formed for the welfare of wounded Turkish soldiers who were notoriously badly looked after. Fred went out on behalf of this committee, and as soon as he had actually finished his job, he travelled west to meet up with his old friend Baker. He arrived at a place called Tash Kazan at just about the time the Ottoman army realised that they had no ability to continue the battle in that part of the world. So Baker fought a famous battle at Tash Kazan as part of a rearguard action. He lost a number of men, but following the action, he retreated again in winter across the Rhodope Mountains, which I think are now in Bulgaria, into Greece. And it was a classic fighting retreat with very little loss of life. Fred was with him the whole way. Now, again, Fred was a non-combatant, and there are some famous images of him wearing his bowler hat and carrying a large stick for protection, standing in front of Baker.
Just a stick?
Yeah, just a stick. Standing in front of Baker, protecting him again from stray bullets. And again, it gives an example of the fact that Fred really had a slightly different attitude towards danger and his personal safety than many other men. They both got back safely. Fred came home, and at a famous speech at the Savage Club, Fred lauded Baker's exploits, which were really, classic military leadership, and did something to help re-establish Valentine Baker's reputation, which never really did recover fully, but was much better after Fred got back and gave this report.
By the way, guys, I just want to interrupt really quickly to ask, what do you think to this t-shirt? If you're half the man I think you are, then I know you're going to love it. Well, I've just designed a few different t-shirts and sweaters, etc. that really reflect our shared interest in British military history. I'll be adding more designs over the next few weeks, so check out the links below or scan the QR codes that are currently on the screen. Every sale means an extra £2 or so for me to keep the channel and the podcast running. Okay guys, sorry for the interruption, let's get back to the film. Burnaby, fighting in various conflicts, being, an advisor and whatnot in various conflicts, doing various sports, learning dozens of languages. That wasn't enough for him. He also took up ballooning. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I would have. And just to go back, he was a superb athlete. He was reckoned to be the strongest man in the British Army. He had a party trick, which was carrying a small pony under one arm. He was an excellent swordsman, and he swam, he rowed, and there was nothing he attempted where he didn't really do very well. Now, regarding ballooning, he was a very serious balloonist. He had started making ascents in the 1860s and continued throughout the 1870s. And he ascended with some of the most famous aeronauts of the time. Some of the trips went a bit better than others. They didn't always come down quite as softly as he might have hoped. But he was very serious about this. He was one of the founding members of the Aeronautical Society and wrote papers on ballooning, certainly serious sort of scientific type papers, and was very, very highly regarded indeed. So that was all very well, and he was discouraged from ballooning by the War Office because, again, it gave publicity which the War Office didn't want. Despite the fact that Fred was one of the first people to actually encourage the use of balloons for reconnaissance purposes, with which he didn't have much luck. But his ambition was always to be the first person to cross the channel solo in a balloon. Now, this might not sound like a big problem today, but in the 1880s, it had been tried on a number of occasions, all of which had either failed because the person had to turn back, or because the person had died in the process. So Fred's attempt at a solo crossing was not something which would be taken lightly by anybody. He didn't have his own balloon, but in 1882 he persuaded a friend of his to lend him his balloon, which he filled up with coal gas at the Dover Gas Works, and he ascended on what he thought was a propitious day, and was doing well. Got halfway across the channel when he was totally becalmed. He'd taken with him a sandwich or two, which he got through, and finished those. And he then smoked a cigar, which wasn't the safest thing to do under a hydrogen balloon. The wind then picked up again, and he eventually set down in Normandy some time later. And in typical fashion, Fred sent a telegram to the balloon owner saying, "Voyage very difficult, but quite amusing." And that was Fred's idea of his balloon. And so, he added this balloon journey to his CV, wrote a not very good book about the journey, which included some of his other stuff on aeronautics. But it's yet another thing that this extraordinary man did.
I mean, do you think he had a bit of a death wish? What do you think drove him to keep doing this stuff?
Yeah, I'm not sure it was a death wish. I mean, this has been argued about quite a lot. He certainly had no regard for his life. I think Fred had some sort of philosophy which was along the lines of, God has given me a time on earth, which I will enjoy to the utmost of my ability. And, I don't know when it's going to come to an end, but I'm not going to do anything to try and unnecessarily prolong it. So if an opportunity like this came along, Fred would just take it. Quite extraordinary. I mean, I don't know anyone like that today.
I think I've worked with a few, but yeah, I'm certainly not in that class. Let's put it that way. So moving on then, and we're coming now towards the final chapter of his life, Sudan. Now he's already been there once and done a bit of a reconnaissance of the country. He goes back. Can you tell us how he ended up back there and what the story is?
Yes. Okay. So after Tashkazan and the retreat across the Russo-Turkish Mountains, Baker was given the job of head of the Egyptian gendarmerie. Now, the gendarmerie was a semi-military force. It was supposed not to fight outside of Egypt, but there was some confusion as to whether Sudan counted as Egypt or not. But the gendarmerie under Baker was given the job of trying to assist in putting down the Mahdi rebellion. Now, the Mahdi was an Islamic extremist who had raised a holy war in the Sudan with the object of actually instituting an Islamic state. He had been very successful, and he had a large number of native troops under his command, which were gradually becoming more skillful. Now, Fred went down to the Sudan, met up with Baker, yet again a non-combatant. He was present basically in an intelligence capacity. Baker was very concerned about the level of training and motivation of the gendarmerie, but was really in a position where he had to set out to try and at least understand what the Mahdi was doing. And within a day or two of leaving his headquarters, they came across a very strong Mahdi force at a place called El Teb, and had no choice but to engage in action. It turned out to be an unmitigated disaster. There was nothing they could do to really prepare or rally their troops, and they were routed. And not only that, but the Mahdi forces actually managed to procure a great deal of the weapons that were left behind by the fleeing force. So the battle was a disaster, not just because Baker's force lost, but because thereafter the Mahdi's force were much, much better armed. And they retreated back to the headquarters. Now, that was all fine. And up to this stage, the British had resisted getting involved in the Mahdi rebellion. But it became apparent that they had to really do something at this stage. And a force was sent to reinforce what was left of Baker's gendarmerie. So Baker, Burnaby, and the new force started heading west again. And by coincidence, bumped into the Mahdi force again at El Teb. So the second Battle of El Teb was fought just a few days after the first one. Fred, of course, was non-combatant, but the fighting became very, very fierce, despite the fact that there were some decent British regiments there. Fred felt he had to get involved and borrowed a shotgun and proceeded to pick off at fairly close range a number of the natives. Now, this wasn't considered to be very sporting, especially when it became apparent that Fred had actually written his tally in his game book after the event. So he again came into a lot of criticism. But he managed to develop an arm wound during the conflict and came back to a hero's welcome, as he generally did whenever he'd been abroad, again to the great consternation of the War Office, who hadn't even known he was going to Sudan in the first place. So the second
They must have really disliked him. The War Office must have hated him.
They did, and especially the Duke of Sussex, I think, too. So yeah, you're quite right. So he couldn't really do wrong in the eyes of the public, and he couldn't really do right in the eyes of the War Office. But anyway, he's now back in the UK, a hero. And one of the things, if you look at the newspapers at the time, many of them had illustrations, cartoons, and Fred was ubiquitous. You really couldn't pick up a journal without seeing Fred with a shotgun, or Fred with his arm in a sling, or Fred on a pony somewhere, or a camel. He was a public figure. Today he'd be called an A-lister.
Sort of like a David Beckham of the Victorian era.
Yes. I think that's probably about as close as you can get.
So let's move on a little bit then. So he's returned to the UK, but then the Sudan hasn't quietened down.
No.
Of course, Gordon is besieged in Khartoum, and an expedition is put together to relieve him.
Yeah.
And I believe our hero is once again at the centre of things. How did that happen?
Well, okay. So 10 years has passed since Burnaby was in Khartoum. The situation deteriorated. The British government was very happy to leave Gordon to his fate, but the British public weren't. And by public pressure, a relief expedition was mounted under General Wolseley. Now, Fred was on very good terms with General Wolseley, but couldn't persuade him to be a formal part of the relief expedition. He also had a disagreement with Wolseley on this point, to which there's some background. Wolseley's military reputation had partly been established by the Red River expedition in northwest Canada, where Wolseley had led an expedition which had used the Red River to actually travel towards the point where he needed to engage with the other forces. And this had been very successful. And the Red River had a lot of rapids, and he had learned how to portage his boats across these rapids. So when he was given the task of relieving Burnaby, he naturally thought that the best approach to Khartoum was to ascend the Nile, portaging the cataracts. And I don't think he had any clear idea of the difference in scale between the cataracts on the Nile and the rapids on the Red River. Fred tried to persuade him unsuccessfully that the far better approach would be to take a ship down the Red Sea and to travel eastwards, as he had done during his trip years before. But this was never going to be on. So the expedition set off, and it had great problems. Fred's leave came around, and he knew that if he went down there, it was very unlikely that Wolseley was going to look a gift horse in the mouth and refuse his services. So he turns up, and Wolseley puts him in charge of portaging equipment across one of the cataracts, which Fred does very successfully, being Fred. And thereafter, when that part of the journey is finished, they are on the Nile, and it becomes clear they're never going to get to Gordon in time. Now, there's a big bend in the Nile at this point, and it's decided by Wolseley that he is going to send a column across the neck of the bend to Khartoum, and that he's going to have a small force which can move fairly quickly, and hopefully he can then catch up to them by river. So the expedition sets off, and the quickest route went via a place called Abu Klea, which was famous for its wells, and so it was very important that when they got to Abu Klea, they rewatered, and then they could continue on. And the column that was put together consisted of heavy cavalry and some other regiments. There was a Gardner gun and some military cannon, some naval cannon, and a lot of camels for transport, which turned out to be a problem. But they got to Abu Klea, but as they were approaching it, they came under sustained sniper fire from the Mahdi's forces, and they were forced to stop before the wells and to undergo a night under fire, which wasn't very pleasant, to put it mildly. The next morning, the commanding officer of the column, to which Burnaby had been attached as second in command, to his delight, formed a square, classic tradition, and started moving towards the enemy. Now, this is where the real problem developed. The camels were put at the center of the square, but their great size meant they were very easy targets for snipers, and they started to fall in great numbers. This meant that the rear of the square had great difficulty in keeping up, and basically the corners, particularly the back left corner of the square, became detached. And it was the back left corner of the square that had been put under Burnaby's command. And of course, being the weak spot, this is where, when the Mahdi attack came, it eventually was aimed. Now, there are literally dozens of reports of the battle written by survivors, and none of them are exactly the same. Everybody says the square broke at the back left corner, and everybody agrees that Fred ended up outside the square on horseback. Why he was outside the square is argued about, whether it's by accident or by design, but he became involved in hand-to-hand combat, and the vast Mahdi forces basically just picked him off, ended up with a spear through his neck, and when the force was finally repelled, he was buried on the spot with 73 other soldiers who had died that day. So it was a bit of a disaster. The column did get to Khartoum eventually, but of course by that stage Gordon was already dead. In fact, he was probably dead by the time they were at Abu Klea. So that was Fred's end.
I've got a note here that Lord Binning recalled that in our little force, his death caused a feeling akin to consternation. In my own detachment, many of the men sat down and cried. What made him so popular, do you think? And were the men really as touched by his death as that makes out?
There are plenty of other reports of people who were devastated at his death. Queen Victoria, in her diary, when she heard the news, records that on learning of Burnaby's death, she took a sharp intake of breath and said, "Poor Burnaby." And she wasn't the only one. Fred had, I think, what today we'd call the common touch. He was a towering presence. He was not somebody who seemed to be known for giving orders for the sake of it, or being difficult with his men for the sake of it. He seemed to have compassion, and he was a public figure, and I'm sure the men in his command must have realized they were lucky to have someone like Fred as their leader. So yes, I think Binning's comment was shared by many, many people. And again, to give an idea about this, in London, when the news became public, newspapers issued special editions just about Burnaby. You know, there might have been a little bit at the end about Abu Klea and how he died, but these were about Burnaby and his life and his death. I mean, I can't think of any recent time when a whole edition of a newspaper has been devoted to the death of anyone, whether it was the late Queen Elizabeth or Churchill or anyone. I mean, this was almost unprecedented. I mean, Fred was extraordinarily well-known and well-loved figure.
And for you yourself, having spent so much time with him, sort of reading his books and getting to know him really, what's your feeling about him as a man? Both, you know, do you feel he comes across as someone that would still do well in modern society today? Is he quite a lovable figure? What's your sense of him?
Yes, it's a very good question. He is a man of his time. I mean, it's difficult to think that a man of that character would make any progress in the army today. Of course, it was a completely different army then. So you'd have to think of him perhaps in some other walk of life. and possibly politics. And in a sense, we haven't discussed it, but Fred stood unsuccessfully for Parliament in Birmingham and was great friends with Lord Randolph Churchill and was a co-founder of the Primrose League, which was very important in Conservative politics at that time. Had he lived, he would almost certainly have got into Parliament, and he would almost certainly have got into cabinet. So he missed out, I think, on the political career. Today, I think, if Fred had a future, it would have been political. He was a man that played by his own rules, and unlike most people who play by his own rules, he came close to winning. Again, if it hadn't been for Abu Klea, it would have been fascinating to see where he had actually ended. He was capable of upsetting people, but he was capable of far more than that. He was capable of motivating people and inspiring them, and he was a great loss. I'm sure if I'd met him, I would have found him awkward, and one could probably see his weaknesses, but he must have been a fascinating man to know.